The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we're debating Bill C-35, an act respecting early learning and childcare in Canada. The purpose of this legislation is to try to solve the issue of high childcare costs in Canada. This legislation does not address the serious economic challenges of implementing a Canada-wide early learning and childcare agreement. I believe that this proposed legislation and the current agreements made by this Liberal government with the provinces will fail to provide universal access to affordable childcare and will cost far more than what this government has estimated. In fact, I found it quite shocking that the Liberal speaker who came just before me admitted that this is not a universal program. And he's right. He admitted the truth. It's going to be a two-tiered program where families that are lucky enough to get a childcare space will benefit immensely. But an estimated 182,000 families, according to the PBO, will be excluded and not have access to an affordable childcare space. Childcare in Canada is provided by several mechanisms, including for-profit and non-profit models, parental care, or care by other relatives. And for the past several decades, the wages of average working families have not increased significantly, while the demands on family finances through taxes, housing, food, and childcare have increased substantially. In the last few years alone, the costs for families have significantly outstripped wage growth. The cost to provide childcare varies based on age, but is a minimum of $1,000 per child. Lower-income families have traditionally had access to subsidies, but these benefits vary across provinces. Having one parent stay at home with a child is becoming unaffordable for many families, and is far easier for families with higher incomes. Access to daycare is already limited in Canada, with wait lists. According to reports out of Quebec, there are an estimated 50,000 children waiting for access to an affordable care space. The price of childcare in Canada is too high for most families, and access to affordable care is limited. Why is childcare so expensive? Well, the key costs for childcare, according to operators, in order of magnitude, are labor, the cost of the facilities, and the costs of food and supplies. Childcare is a labor-intensive operation, and wages vary. The cost to create a space to be child-appropriate and the accompanying rental, mortgage, insurance, and maintenance costs are significant. And finally, the cost of food and other supplies have increased dramatically. Now, what is a common factor of all three of these costs? They've all been severely impacted by high inflation. Inflation has increased the cost of labor, it has increased the costs of rent and mortgages dramatically, and as everyone can see when they go to their local grocery store, the price of food has gone up by 12%. Childcare operators are not immune from facing these costs. And the fact is that this Liberal government, through their inflationary policies, are driving up the cost of childcare in Canada. Now, the government's solution to this problem, a problem that they themselves created, has been to sign agreements with the provinces to subsidize the cost of childcare and to implement cost controls on wages, facilities, and food in order to regulate a price for families that will eventually reach $10 a day. Unfortunately, this is unsustainable because since it is government spending that caused the inflation in the first place, more spending will only increase inflation further. The result will be an inflationary spiral that will further increase the costs of childcare and the costs to maintain this program. And given our current deficit, the government will either have to raise taxes on Canadians or take on more debt to sustain this program. Now, what are some examples of this inflationary spiral? Well, speaking to childcare operators in Alberta, I've already heard a number of significant challenges that this government has failed to address. Childcare workers in Alberta can be paid up to around $23 an hour. But due to regulations and these agreements, operators cannot raise their costs by more than 3% annually. Now, according to Statistics Canada, private sector wages rose by over 5% last year. Government regulations are preventing childcare operators from paying their staff even enough to keep up with the rate of inflation. There is also intense competition for childcare workers. School districts can often afford to pay $30 an hour with benefits, and I've been told that schools are even poaching staff from daycares because they're in desperate need of these workers as well. Now, under this government's agreements, daycares have been put at an economic disadvantage in attracting workers, which will lead to a significant loss in daycare capacity, meaning less access to childcare. Now, the proposed solution for this inflation by proponents of even more government intervention in early childcare is, surprise, more inflationary spending. By raising wages even further for childcare workers, the school boards and others will also try to compete by raising their wages even further. And this will result in an inflationary cycle where taxpayers will need to pay much higher taxes as schools and early childhood care centers compete for limited workers. Now, I've also spoken to childhood care operators who have had to pay increased rents and mortgages on their facilities. As everyone knows, mortgages and rental rates have skyrocketed under 8 years of this Liberal government, particularly in the last year. Now, under agreements that this government signed, childcare operators are limited in the costs that they can bill the government towards their rent and mortgage. And since they are mandated to charge families a fixed price for childcare, there is no way for these operators to make up the difference other than by reducing other costs, aka food for children, shutting down their capacity by letting go workers, or shutting down altogether, which we've started to see. The laws of supply and demand mean that this government must either restrict the capacity of daycares or dramatically increase funding beyond what they promised. The first option is unfair. It's going to leave so many families out. And the second option is financially unsustainable. This argument is backed up by research from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, which reported in February of last year that the Liberals' plan is not sufficient to meet the demand for childcare. In fact, they estimate that it will fall short in providing spaces for 182,000 children. 182,000 children who are being left behind by this Liberal government with no plan in this legislation to provide their families with an affordable childcare space. Now, what we're talking about here is essentially a more focused application of the wage and price controls implemented under the Anti-Inflation Act passed by former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau in 1975. In seeking to combat the high inflation at the time, the government passed legislation to control increases in prices and wages. The results were economically disastrous, and the policy was rescinded shortly thereafter. Today, the Liberals are trying to implement wage and price controls through their early learning and childhood care agreements. Now, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman put it better than I ever could by comparing this kind of policy to putting a kettle full of water on a hot stove. When the boiling water begins to push off the kettle lid, the appropriate thing to do is to take the lid off and turn down the heat. Well, what this government is doing is putting a brick on top of the lid and letting the kettle explode. Well, the result is that the pot will explode and this policy will collapse in on itself. It's true for this childcare policy. The Liberals claim that this will reduce the effects of inflation on families, but the reality is that this is only meant to cover up, to mask, to hide the symptoms of inflation while doing nothing to solve the underlying issue of inflation itself. It is not a cure for inflation, because as this government continues to spend more, it will drive up inflation. The cost of this program will continue to rise dramatically in order to maintain the fixed price of $10 a day. Demand from families will build up, and eventually the program will collapse in on itself. Universal access to affordable childcare is the stated goal of this legislation and early learning and childcare agreements. But the current plan fails to meet those objectives. I believe that this plan will lead to a further loss in childcare capacity as operators close down from unsustainable cost increases and the inability to find labor to fill their positions. The result will be a two-tiered daycare system where those who are lucky enough to get their child into a regulated, affordable childcare space will reap the benefits and save tens of thousands of dollars a year, while many families will continue to have to use expensive, unregulated childcare or make arrangements with family. Now, the families that will benefit the most from this system are those with the highest incomes. Research from the OECD indicates that the vast majority of children in regulated childcare come from those with the highest incomes. children from low-income families are disproportionately underrepresented in childcare spaces. Now, in their efforts to implement a absolute, across-the-board, no matter what your income is, price of $10 a day for all families, the government has failed to take into account the need to provide equity for low-income families. Consequently, the benefits of this Liberal program will disproportionately benefit those with higher incomes who often already have and can afford a regulated childcare space. Ironically, it was the Liberals who ran attacks against Conservatives, claiming that our universal childcare benefit gave benefits to millionaires. The fact is that this Liberal plan benefits those with the highest incomes, including millionaires, far more than it does low-income families. In conclusion, making childcare more affordable is an important economic and political goal. The current plan by these Liberals will fail to do that. It's unacceptable to leave 182,000 children out of this system, and it's unacceptable to put this unacceptable debt burden on Canadians. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member spoke at great length about how he is opposed to the particular program that the government has put together, but he fell short from saying that he would actually be voting against it. I'm asking this because we've, after hours of debate on this with Conservatives not committing, we started to hear this afternoon a couple of Conservatives start to commit that they were voting in favour of it. Now, it's obviously quite normal for different people or different members from the same political party to vote differently, but can the member in fact confirm that he will be voting against this particular bill?
Honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
The program is flawed. I've demonstrated how clearly it's flawed. And it's my job as a parliamentarian, as a member of this opposition, to call out this government on the flaws in their legislation, because that is the purpose of our Westminster system of parliament. Opposition parties hold the government accountable in order to get better outcomes for Canadians. And I look forward to seeing this bill at committee. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. And I look forward to seeing concrete proposals to come forward to make childcare more affordable for families. But the current plan put forward by the Liberals, it has tremendous risk and tremendous challenges, and these Liberals are not being honest with Canadians about those challenges.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Peterborough. No.
It's Peterborough.
Kawartha. That's what Peterborough Kawartha. Yeah.
Thank you very much to my honourable colleague for his intervention. It was excellent, and the facts and data are really, really important when you're having this conversation because, quite frankly, it is a very emotional conversation. The welfare of our children is very emotional, and we want our children to have access to the best quality care. And so I really value the facts and data that he has put forth today. And I guess what I would ask him is what does he see as the one thing we could do, a strong amendment that we could bring forth as Conservatives to better this bill?
Good question.
Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, I want to thank my colleague for that question and for her advocacy on this issue. I think we need to look at the free market and how free market mechanisms can be complemented by limited government intervention to provide more supply when there is a need for demand. There is a huge demand for childcare in this country, even before $10 a day daycare is brought in, even before government subsidies are brought in. How do we create that supply? We need to look at regulations that are preventing people from starting a new childcare operation. We need to look at getting more access to workers, whether they're visas for people working abroad or getting people upgraded on their education here in Canada, so we can increase the pool of available workers who can provide childcare. And I think we need to look at, the inflationary spending of this government and how it's driving up the cost of food, the cost of rents and mortgages, and the cost of labor, and how that's impacting childcare operations across Canada. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Rivière-des-Mille-Îles.
The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. My question is for my colleague. We're talking about provincial jurisdiction once again. Quebec has full jurisdiction. This is for a 5-year period, $6 billion, $30 billion for the next 5 years in total. In the Conservative view, is that amount of money acceptable? Are they in favour of this bill?
For Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, as I outlined in my speech, one of my greatest concerns with this legislation is that the government can't actually give us a full estimation on what this program is going to cost. If they're going to provide childcare for those 182,000 families that the PBO has estimated will be left out of this program, how many billions of dollars more will need to be added to this program to maintain that? How has the government projected the cost of inflation from this increased government spending, increased government debt? Have they projected what taxes they're going to have to increase to maintain this program? I'm just very concerned. We haven't been given a straightforward, clear fiscal plan from this government on how they're going to maintain this program. And frankly, I think it's a shame because it's going to be a two-tier system where low-income families are left out in the cold and high-income families disproportionately are going to get the benefits. Thank you.